Test. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's William R. Eadington Fellows Colloquium, sponsored by UNLV Libraries, Special Collections and Archives, and the Center for Gaming Research. I'm Peter Michel. Today we will hear from our current Eadington Fellow, Dr. Gary Ettari, Associate Professor of English at the University of North Carolina-Asheville. A Renaissance scholar in real life, Dr. Ettari comes to his current research by an interesting, if circuitous, intellectual journey, which I hope he will share. His lecture, for those of you who are not reading, is entitled Menus, Theater, and the Marketplace, the History and Aesthetics of Food in Las Vegas. Gary.
Thank you so much, Peter. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. First, before I begin, I want to express my profound gratitude to the staff of Special Collections, including Peter Michel, Sue Kim Chung, Aaron, Darnell, Stacy, Ariana, Tammy, Corey, and all the others who have helped make my time here as Eadington Fellow so pleasant and productive. For those who may not be aware of this fact, Special Collections at UNLV is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary repository of knowledge concerning Nevada, but also beyond. And I would suggest that a visit might be in order if you were at all curious about anything having to do with this region. It's an extraordinary facility. So thank you all for making me feel so welcome. A bit of background, as Peter alluded to, I was trained in the late 90s and early aughts as a scholar of Renaissance literature. At that time, literary theory is about as faddish as everything else. So at that time, one of the fads in terms of understanding Renaissance literature was what they call body studies. So looking at the way in which the body as both feeling subject, but also object, cultural object, political object, how the body was sort of implicated in and talked about in Renaissance literature. And my own work on my dissertation had to do with how Renaissance poets appropriated medical rhetoric to talk about love and desire. One thinks, for example, of how the opening sonnet of Edmund Spenser's Amoretti talks about how the secrets of love are enclosed in what he calls heart's closed bleeding book. So the book is like this private sort of heart. The book is within the heart. The book of love is within the heart, and it's surrounded by like this bloody sort of thing that you almost have to peel away and discover. That was just really interesting to me. So that was my work on Renaissance literature. And what started happening was I started thinking about the different ways in which this could be, the body studies could be sort of used as a lens through which to view other things. I teach at a small school, a wonderful one, UNC Asheville, and as a result of teaching at a relatively small school, probably about 1/10 the enrollment of UNLV, I should think, is that I have to, all faculty are required to teach a little bit out of their specialty. And so I began teaching things like readings and film and other things. And so I started thinking, I wonder how the body can be implicated in other things. So I've done some work on the body in film. I've published an article on particularly the commodification of the masculine body in Steven Soderbergh's Magic Mike, which to my mind is might be the greatest movie ever about capitalism. And no, not just because Matthew McConaughey is in it. Although that did begin the McConaissance, I acknowledge. And also, I've just published a book on the body and art and religion, particularly as it relates to the Mormon religion. So I've just been sort of thinking about how the body is implicated in a lot of things. And so I suppose, ultimately, my chief academic fascination is not with one period or one thing, but it's really about what I would call the psychology and the physiology of desire, which of course is rooted in the body and is within the body, and we can't ever really escape it. And I just find that interesting. And if one is interested in, say, the psychology and physiology of desire, Las Vegas is a pretty good place to look. I teach a course on Las Vegas at my home institution, and one of the things I tell my students is that if you want to understand America, you should look at Las Vegas, because everything that happens in Las Vegas happens in other cities too, but in Las Vegas, a lot of the time, it is more on the surface and more easily recognized, and therefore more easily studied. So that's what brings me to menus and food and aesthetics. Just as a bit of brief sort of biography, also, I grew up in South Florida, which if you don't know South Florida, when I was a kid there in the 1970s and 80s, I mean, it was sort of like a kind of a swamp in the middle and just a little sort of ring of concrete with some strip malls around the edges. And one of the things that they did a lot to get people to come to Florida is they built places for tourists to come. Not just Disney World, but places like Gatorland, still my favorite Florida attraction, by the way. And Lion Country Safari, and lots of these other places. So as a young person, I sort of grew up being surrounded by like bombastic signage and, sort of broad and sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle appeals to the tourist sensibility. So that might be a little bit of what also sharpens my interest in Las Vegas. So that's a bit of an overview and a bit of a beginning. I'd like to just sort of walk you through a little bit of what my project is. My time here has been spent chiefly focusing on menus and other artifacts. The larger project is envisioned as a book-length study of not just the history of food in Las Vegas for about the last 100 years, but particularly the ways in which Las Vegas marketed and markets food, and the aesthetic and affective implications of that for the tourist subjects that come to this fair city. So I'm interested in this project not just in menus and these wonderful artifacts that are in special collections, but also larger questions about how the body and affect is implicated in economics generally, but also particularly in tourist economies. So that's the deal. So the overview is essentially here. These are the three goals as I've laid them out. I'm influenced by a couple of people who write about economics, particularly Jeffrey Nealon. He argues that there is a kind of economy of intensification, that here in the 21st century, yes, things are still produced, yes, things are still purchased, but often the body itself and bodily and emotional and affective responses to things are what drive markets, are what drive the marketplace. I'll get a bit more into that in a bit. I want to begin with a gesture to a couple of theorists. Michael Owen Jones, who was the president of the American Folklore Society in 2005, talked a little bit about food and culture and foodways, but also about the importance of looking at food and things surrounding food in perhaps a more symbolic way than his discipline was used to. He says, symbolic discourse utilizing food is more pervasive and complex, and it involves more processes in a wider variety of circumstances and with more diverse meanings than is generally discussed. And that's a quote I ran across that really sort of got me thinking about what are the different ways that we can think of food symbolically, and how does this connect to some of these larger issues and ideas that were just sort of rattling around in my mostly empty head. And partial answer to the question is menus. Their construction, their layout, their symbolic resonance and importance to the person who is reading them. And Alison Perlman has it's really interesting if y'all haven't read this. She's got a book on essentially restaurant menus and their rhetorical functions. Restaurant menus and the art of persuasion. And she views menus as part of the larger whole of the way that restaurants and food spaces construct, appeal to, and influence what we might simply call consumer desire, right? How do menus, along with things like restaurant atmospherics, help draw people, not only draw people into the restaurant space, but how do they influence what people order, how they think of food, how they feel about it, those sorts of things. She goes through just a few examples in this quote, right? The colorful collection of plastic food samples, the menu, any salad bar is always its own menu within the main menu. She talks about the fast food window displays and all these sorts of things. So she's looking at these different ways in which artifacts of the marketplace are employed in the service of getting someone to buy something to eat at a particular place. And this is all over the place in a lot of the menus that are in special collections. One thing I've found really interesting is there's a kind of, there's a sort of thread that runs through some menus from different establishments and even different eras. But the main sort of symbolic motif is theater. And this relationship between theater and food. And in some of these menus, food and eating sort of becomes the theater. This is nothing new, but it's also quite contemporary. Think, for example, of, I'm sure your friend and mine, Gordon Ramsay, right, who has basically brought food as theater and made it into an art form. And he's quite clever at that for a number of reasons, not least of which is because he has quite brilliantly made himself both the protagonist and antagonist of a show like, say, Hell's Kitchen, right? He is the sort of angry, temperamental chef yelling at his younger charges, but he's also the victim of their incompetence, right? So dining and art and theater, and this thread of theater being a motif in menus is, I think, a highly significant part of what my project will be. And this is from a relatively early menu. This is from the El Rancho Vegas restaurant. By the way, as you can see, America's finest Western hotel. And this is the cover of the menu. So you've got this whole sort of, hey, these are the doors, and they're going to open. And inside the doors, you're actually going to find a theater not full of actors, but full of food. And what you've got here, I hope you can see it, it's a little bit small, I apologize for that. But this is the inside of the menu, and you've got all these trappings of drama and theater. You've got the curtains, and you've got all of these sort of subtitles and sections. You've got Act 1 on the upper left. You've got overtures at the top center. You've got Act 2. You've got the finale right in the middle. You've got the season ticket. You've got the curtain raisers. You've got the encores. And you actually have dishes named after a lot of sort of vaudeville / Western theater types. Like, for example, the ham, or the Annie Oakley, or the leading lady, which is 3 slices of French toast. Okay? So this is, I would suggest, not simply, haha, here's a motif and isn't this clever? This is a way that this particular restaurant, and other restaurants do it as well, which I'll show you, but it's a way in which this particular restaurant makes food and the consuming of food into a kind of theater that the diner has to participate in and is therefore endlessly implicated in. Okay? You've got to order something from the menu. You've got to express an affinity for a character, or you've got to be interested in, maybe a smaller encore, or, maybe an overture versus an act 2, right? So you're in the menu and you're in the world of the menu, and you've got to participate in this theater of consumption if you're a patron of this restaurant and you want something to eat. And so I find this really fascinating. And there were a couple of other menus. I'll show you this in just one second. This is from the Center Stage restaurant. And you've got Jane Avril, who, if you don't know, was sort of a famous kind of can-can dancer back in the day. So there's a kind of motif of like sort of show business, maybe a sort of, elegant Parisian theater experience thing happening. And the same thing happens if you look at the inside of this menu. You've got the stars, you've got the supporting cast, you've got the overture, you've got between the acts. So again, this is consumption as theater. And this is also, I would suggest, a kind of reification of consumer desire. We've all done this. We feel a little bit hungry. Maybe we don't simply want to, spend 5 hours cooking roast and some Yorkshire pudding at home. So we go out to eat. And we're confronted with choices, and we're confronted also, whatever restaurant we go into, even if it's a fast food restaurant, we can immediately walk into, let's say, a Chick-fil-A restaurant and be able to discern the aesthetics from a KFC restaurant, and be able to discern those aesthetics from a Bojangles restaurant, and be able to discern those aesthetics from a Popeyes restaurant. Right? So yeah, they're all similar in their products, but every restaurant is trying very subtly to kind of to slightly change your consumer identity and as they invite you to consume what they wish to serve you. So this is sort of what's going on here. And you've even got the Center Stage restaurant here, right? And the Olio. And so all these references to burlesque and theater, etc. So this is how menus start to construct, and I would suggest script, a theater of gustatory desire. All right? A little bit later, this is from Caesar's Palace, and here you've got the star of the show and dinner on, dare I suggest, equal billing, right? This is the inside of the menu. So Tom Jones takes up half, And the entrees and the desserts and the appetizers take up the other half. So this is slightly different than the menu as theater per se, but still this is a combination of entertainment and eating. Dinner theater, right? You're being asked to be present at more than one aesthetic event at the same time. And I think there's a really interesting psychology here, which I'll get to in a bit, okay? This is an example from Circus Circus, and this is essentially the playbill as menu. That looks like a playbill. At least it does to me. The French Love Connection. You've got the Hippodrome Theater on the front. You've got just what you would have on the front of a theater, of a playbill, right? The names of people who are going to be in the show, all that sort of thing. But this is actually not a playbill, it's a menu. Okay, so again, you've got that blending, which I think is quite fascinating. So the other part, and the wonderful, and thanks to Sue Kim for this suggestion, there's a lot in the archives that have to do with, you get to see behind the curtain of the great and powerful Oz once in a while. And I was privileged to be able to do that the past couple of weeks. And one of the things I found, which was, to me, solid gold, was training manuals, which normally we probably, okay, it's a training manual. But a lot of language in the training manuals themselves talked about how the employees needed to act as if they were indeed actors in a play or in a movie. And so they had a script. And some of the scripts are pretty granular. For example, the top quote is from Leonardo's restaurant training manual. Be aware that you are always on stage and have an audience to perform to. Smile, maintain proper posture. I must have been talking to my grandmother. And portray positive body language. Remain visible so people can always see you. Remember, 2 minutes to you is like 10 minutes for your guests. So this is an extraordinary bit of, I would suggest, scripting for the actors who are the restaurant servers and other workers in the restaurant. Yeah. Same thing from the Main Street Station Guest Services Manual. Think of yourself as having won a big role in a very successful production. Your part is so big, you are rarely off stage. You're going to be very busy. And if you really try to practice all the service skills we've talked about, you won't have much time to worry about your appearance. That means every detail has to be perfect before you go on stage. Right? So there's a lot of this kind of theatrical language and scripted behavior in a lot of these manuals. This is just a couple of shorter, more brief examples. Again, from Main Street Station, the top quote, "We know we have a cast full of winners. We just need to share the spotlight and cheer each other on because we're all on stage every day, every minute." Okay, that's a not so subtle reminder that indeed the spotlight is on you as a worker in this restaurant. Don't do anything wrong. Look your best. Have that great posture. Be aware of time passing and think more of your audience and how time is passing for them than how time is passing for you. Okay? And then I find this fascinating, the 10 and 5 rules. Anybody ever heard of this? Has anybody ever worked food service before? I've worked food service. I found it simultaneously exhilarating and soul-crushing. But that's really for my therapist, not you all. The 10 and 5 rule, when a guest or employee is 10 feet away from you, make eye contact and smile. As the guest approaches within 5 feet of you, speak first with a friendly greeting. You know what that is? If you've ever done any acting, that's spatial awareness. That's blocking. That's, okay, how close am I going to get to Sue Kim if, I'm playing Hamlet and Sue Kim is playing Horatio? Oh, I've got to think about all this stuff. This is theater. This is theater training, right? You're creating this immersive experience for, I shouldn't call them customers. I should now call them guests. Isn't that the rhetoric? Please get this guest some more silver dollar pancakes. I think that's what they say now. So what does all this mean, and how does all this sort of funnel into things like commerce and economics? This is from an article in Western Folklore called "All Those Mounds of Shrimp, Las Vegas Buffets Considered." And one of the things that Elizabeth Adams does in the article is to talk about how, again, sort of how granular and detailed so much of the thinking around a lot of this stuff is, particularly for, the big resorts on the Strip. She's talking about the Paris buffet, right? Like many other modern casinos, Paris has a faux sky ceiling with clouds and an arch ceiling, which gives the feeling of the outside inside. The street is paved with cobblestones, and lining the walkway are French-themed shops, children's toy and clothing featuring Madeleine and Babar, a patisserie, et cetera, et cetera. So Elizabeth Adams is looking at all of these kind of granular things that these resorts do. I'm sure at least some of you have been in the Venetian and the Grand Canal shops, right? You've got that sort of ceiling. This actually goes back to a term that was coined in the 70s, I believe, called architainment. It's a portmanteau of architecture and entertainment. And I think Las Vegas has a lot of those sorts of examples. And I feel like there are some places, notably in Las Vegas, that really take this immersion to another level. This is the Library restaurant in the Nomad. And you don't just look at a library while you're eating, you are in the library while you're eating. I've found this really interesting because this is a kind of immersive aesthetic that I would suggest is not that different from those theater-styled and themed menus, right? You're sort of inviting the consumer in, and you've got to structure it and give it a certain feel, a certain aesthetic, because you are expecting a certain response, right? That just looks kind of cool. I mean, I don't know if I can afford the $8,200 for like the one scoop of butter that they charge. I understand they do a credit check before you order a martini there, but it is fascinating that to look at just the floor. I mean, think of a Denny's, or think of some roadside diner you've been in, right? The ceiling is maybe half the height of the ceiling in this room. And look at the sort of grandiosity that is going on here, right? And you've got books and books and books, and you've got the second story up there as well. So you've got this immersion in the whole sort of library aesthetic, and then you've also got this sort of grand feeling of the high ceilings. Yeah. There's another restaurant, I'm sure you all are familiar with this one, Picasso at the Bellagio. And here, it's a slightly different kind of immersion, but nonetheless, I mean, I don't know if you can see, the table's kind of obscure, but the carpet has all these kind of Picasso-inspired colors and sort of designs. They've got Picassos sort of spread throughout the restaurant. I don't have a picture of it, but at the small bar they have, as you're sitting at the bar, there's just a huge Picasso that you were looking at while you're sipping your Tom Collins or your Appletini or whatever you might order there. So this is another attempt to sort of aesthetically draw in the consumer. And fascinatingly enough, to me at any rate, all of this attention that's being paid to aesthetics is both about food and not about food. Sure, you're there to have your Appletini or, a $10,000 lamb chop or whatever's on the menu. But also, these places want almost all of your senses engaged at the same time. They want you to look. They want you to feel. They want you to see. They want you to hear. They want you to taste. They want to engage the entire human sensorium as much as possible. And I find that somewhat fascinating, right? simple-minded me, I would think, oh, you just want to appeal visually and then like you want to get them something that tastes good, right? But this sort of indicates the level of sophistication when it comes to appealing to consumers. There's also, I think, sometimes what I might call the aesthetics of abundance. I'll get to the economics of this in a moment too. This, if I'm remembering correctly, this is the original buffet at the Rancho Las Vegas. I believe it began in 1948. And in the very beginning, it was just an idea, I think it was $1. And the idea was, oh, we don't want the gamblers to leave the casino to like go down the street to get something to eat because they might not come back. We're just going to give them, a swan ice sculpture and some cold cuts, and they'll stick around. Somewhat similar, by the way, to that brilliant entrepreneur, Benny Binion, who I'm sure you all know. Benny Binion did not invent the stool, but what he invented was putting the stool in front of a slot machine. Because before he did that, people used to stand up at the slot machines. You put a comfortable stool in front of a slot machine, guess what's going to happen? People are going to stay longer, right? Similar idea here. This is one of the pictures from, I believe, the Bacchanal Buffet that Caesars uses to sort of promote it, right? Here again, the abundance. I mean, I like food, and I usually get pretty hungry, but I can't eat all that. Right? But again, I think there's a kind of aesthetic here. And there's an awareness of, there's such a fine awareness of the human tendency to want more than we could ever really do something with. I keep thinking of one of my favorite bands, U2, and the video, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, which they filmed in Las Vegas, which I think was so brilliant, right? Because that song is about the endless infinitude of desire that never leaves us, right? And I think there's something going on here with the aesthetics of abundance that are sort of trying to, I mean, intellectually we know we probably can't on our own eat approximately 60 pounds of cooked meat in one sitting, but that's not the point. The point is to sort of demonstrate all of this wonderfulness and draw us in. Don't you want more? Sure, who doesn't want more? Right? Okay, so what does all this mean and how might this connect to economic theory and the marketplace and all that sort of thing? So this again is from the Adams article. And she writes, the gaming industry has to ratchet up the experience in a profound way to make the lure strong enough to keep the visitor coming back. The visitor, of course, is complicit in this through folkloric communication, etc. But then, Adams says, the buffets are part of this larger experience and one in which there is no real perception of loss. And I think this is really important. One of the things about hunger and that particular desire is it never goes away. To be alive is to be hungry. Maybe not every minute of every day, but every 4 or 5 hours, it recurs pretty regularly. At least it does for me. One Snickers bar a day just doesn't do it. I need like 20 in order to maintain a healthy balance. Right? Also, 155-gallon drum of Coca-Cola each day. And so I think that there's this really interesting shift. And it's actually, if you're interested and you want a really amazing history and look at the strategy of casino design, there's a woman named Natasha Schull, and she wrote a book called Addiction by Design, and she looked at the shift, the history of the shift between, there used to be in Las Vegas, the great prevalence of what they call table games, right? Craps, poker, blackjack, whatever. And then the slot machines took over. And she's got this theory about slot machines, and slot machines create an entirely different aesthetic loop and experience. They allow you to live in a kind of zone that shuts everything out. Table games are more social. And a lot of people don't want that anymore, right? They just want to look at the screen because we're really used to looking at screens, right? And I think actually the buffet functions in a similar way. It draws you in. When I go to the buffet, I know, I can't eat 82 pieces of chocolate cake that are in front of me, but I'm drawn to that. Hey, look at all that cake. That looks pretty good, right? It's really interesting psychology. And here's where I think it gets real. The body, I think, has become the central focus of the marketplace. I suppose on some level it always has been, but I feel like it's become more intensified, and there are many more strategic matrices surrounding the body for the sole purpose of connecting bodily response with the getting of money from that person. And this is from Jeffrey Nealon's book, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Just-in-Time Capitalism. One of the chapters in that book is called Empire of the Intensities, a Random Walk Down Las Vegas Boulevard. And he looks to Las Vegas as this sort of great new frontier of a new kind and different kind of marketplace. One that involves what he calls intensification. And when talking about Las Vegas, he writes, in such settings as Las Vegas, you don't so much consume goods as you have experiences, where your subjectivity can be intensified, bent, and retooled. In contemporary Las Vegas, you are offered opportunities for doing work on yourself, experiencing, seeing, feeling, rather than opportunities for confronting, overcoming, purchasing, or otherwise consuming some other. The force of the new globalized economic empire, the empire one spies from Caesar's palace, doesn't primarily turn outward in an expansive colonialist or consumerist assimilation. Now it turns inward toward intensification of existing biopolitical resources. The final product in the end is you and me. I think Nealon's right. And I think that he's right to such an extent that if you pay attention to any space, any public space through which you walk, you can, without too much trouble, really understand why that space was constructed and how that space was constructed in order to affect you. If you walk into a classroom and you see a bunch of desks and rows, you get an image of what might happen in that classroom, right? If you go to the Bacchanal buffet and you see 86,000 pieces of chocolate cake and 22 tons of snow crab legs, you get a sense pretty quickly about what that space is about and how it's working to affect you, right? So Nealon's argument is that this has become more sophisticated and more intensified as the marketplace, which he claims is now based more than ever on speculation and feeling, rather than actual stuff being produced, is really the world that we're walking through. We are walking through this sort of constructed world that is designed very intentionally, every space we go into, to sort of elicit certain responses from us, okay? So what does all this mean, and how do we process all this, and what do we do with it all? Well, just a couple of ideas to wrap things up. An economy based on speculation and intensification, I would suggest, depends upon emotions and aesthetics. It depends upon affect. It depends upon those bio-responses in order to run. That's the wheels of the economy based on intensification, okay? Think of Bitcoin. I mean, I'm old enough to not know anything about how Bitcoin works, except to know that it's like not a real coin, right? It's not a quarter that I can use to go and purchase 1/4 of a candy bar, right? Think of the emotions of stock market investors. I don't know how many of y'all listen to business news or what have you, but almost every time you hear a stock market report, one of the things that is mentioned is how investors are feeling. Investors were anxious today about the news of inflation. Investors were optimistic about the bond market. There's a lot of emotional language in terms of how markets get discussed now. Software and phone updates, right? If you want higher resolution in a game that you have on your phone, you've got to download it. But you want that higher resolution because that higher resolution creates an aesthetic affect and effect on you, and you want it, right? Why on earth wouldn't you want a 4K TV instead of, the old Emerson with the hi-fi record player in it, that showed Howdy Doody or whatever thing, right? So we want this, and the market knows that we want it, and it monetizes that desire constantly. Hunger is one of the most constant and dependable desires to which the marketplace can appeal, as I've already mentioned. We're all going to be hungry. We're not pythons. I don't eat like a really big cheeseburger and then 3 months later, I kind of get hungry again, right? I also think that consumers do hunger for immersive experiences and abundance. The buffet is one, but also something as small as, does anybody know what fronting is in a supermarket? So my son worked at Ingles Market, which is a East Coast market. And I, many years ago, worked at Winn-Dixie. And one of the things that the managers would tell us to do, so Saturday morning was a big morning for supermarkets. Lots of people come in, they buy stuff. And one of the things that the managers told us to do was to go around and front all the shelves, and that is bring forward the soup cans, the dog food cans, the cracker boxes to the front of the shelf so that it looks like the supermarket has a lot more than it has. So just that little thing is a signal to the consumers that, oh yeah, we have plenty. Come on. Buy 26 boxes of Wheat Thins if you want. Even though I've only got 2, but they're right at the front of the shelf, right? So these little things that surround us. And lastly, I would suggest that what all of this work that I'm doing really sort of points to is how eminently adaptable marketplaces are. Once the marketplace figures out that we are all desiring and hungry subjects, it is remarkable how good it is at identifying those things that we want and monetizing them. And now, as Nealon suggests, and I happen to agree with them, a lot of things that are monetized aren't things so much as experiences, as moments of affect, or little sort of gestures towards our desire, designed to kind of tease out our desire. So the marketplace both responds to our desires, but it also sort of creates those desires, stimulates them. And so this is the larger point I hope to discuss in my work. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much again to Peter and Sue Kim and to all of the library staff. I appreciate it. That's the end.